Creating inclusive workplace presentations and documents, Module 3, and also the last module in this series. We're going to discuss how to prepare your presentation materials next. I have created a prior YouTube video that goes over how to do this in a little bit more detail. I give some tutorials on how to do this using Word or Microsoft 365, specifically Word documents. And so I'm going to link that video because I do have that tutorial closer to the end of that video. So if you want some tutorial level instruction on this, you're gonna want to rewatch that video or watch it for the first time. You can skip ahead because again, I go through some of this, what I'm about to do in detail. So just skip ahead to get to the tutorial. So again, these next two slides I'm gonna show you, I'm gonna run through them pretty quick because if you've watched my prior video, you've heard this before, so it'd be a refresher, and if not, you're gonna want to go back to that and look at those tutorials. So here we go. Number 1, I emailed or sent information I wanted my colleagues / stakeholders to review in advance of presentation. This is a reminder. I believe I've said this in as a part of this series already. You can see how I process information. I need to have looked over the agenda, the handout, whatever, ahead of time. Again, I get sometimes there's an element of maybe surprise, or there's a reason why you would withhold that up until the presentation. But if it's not sensitive information, or you know it would make sense for somebody to have at least skimmed it, take time to have sent this, if not a week in advance, a few days in advance. If you're someone like me, or if your colleagues are someone like me, I should say, they're gonna really appreciate this. It's hard for me to process in the moment, so I really need to have looked over the materials or the agenda prior to the meeting day. So for those of the people that you're going to be presenting to who have that kind of mindset, need that processing time, go ahead and do that. It's a good practice. I provide information in multiple formats, i.e. I have a few hard copies. Let's say you're doing the presentation in person, so you have a few hard copies of the slides in regular and large print, key highlight documents, etc. And so people, again, if it is not clear, learning styles are different, abilities are different, the way that our preferences are different if it's not connected to, like, let's say a disability that someone's been diagnosed with. People learn differently and take in information differently, and so you should have some hard copies available. Maybe it's a resource issue, and so you can't have a hard copy for every person, but you should have some for at least neighbors to share, like neighbors being people sitting next to each other in the presentation. If it really is like we really can't afford to print materials, then this is something you would have wanted to ask in advance. Who prefers or who needs hard copies of the handouts, the slides, etc., to be able to follow along? This is very important. I checked to make sure I use 12 to 14 point text for my hard copy or digital handouts, and I use at least 18 to 24 point text, maybe even larger, for screen projected materials, and I use a sans serif font. Examples of a sans serif font are Arial, Helvetica, Tahoma, for all of my materials. A sans serif font, they're really readable. They're very easy to read, and I think it's pretty obvious why you don't want to go lower than a 12-point font, because that makes it harder to read. To change these settings, to make sure you have even changed your default settings within Word document, I show how to do this in that tutorial video. Okay, next up, I use a high color contrast design for handouts and PowerPoint presentations. You'll see my preference. I use a lot of PowerPoints, and so maybe you use PowerPoint, maybe you use another software, but either way, whatever projected materials you're going to be using, you're going to want to make sure it's a high color contrast design color scheme. So black and white is the obvious example of a high color contrast. You're also going to want to refrain from using neon colors. People who have vision issues or low vision, colorblind, this just creates a lot of problems, so stay away from neon colors. Next up, I present content on documents and projected materials using a logical heading and subheading order. This makes documents extremely readable, easy to follow. Chunking out that information is going to be key as well, and so make sure you're doing this. Here are a few more reminders. Again, I show you an example of this and what to do in that tutorial. So please, please, please watch that. If you're more of a learn by watching kind of person, learn by doing, you can follow along. So that is why I'm moving pretty fast. But making sure you have adequate white space. Again, this helps with the readability of your materials, any of the supporting materials you prepare to go along with your public speaking portion of the presentation. I present information in digestible chunks, so you really space it out. You use bulleted lists when appropriate to make it as straightforward as you possibly can. For longer reports, I have a summary or a key highlights handout. This is my go-to. Some people call it an abstract, something that if someone wants just like a quick summary or an at-a-glance sheet of what this presentation is going to be about, what key findings are, what your projections are, you give them that. You provide them with that, and they can follow along using that in your public speaking presentation. And if they want more information, if they want that detail, that rich detail that you provide in the longer report, let's say, they have that option, right? But let's say they don't read all like that, or they don't have time to read, or for whatever reason, they can't get to it. And also beyond that, not everyone receives information and is able to process information through reading. And so a long report is just not going to be accessible to everyone because of their learning style. So just keep that in mind. Let's go over a few more notes on some materials. I use the accessibility function to check the materials I developed in Microsoft Word, Acrobat Pro, etc. I use Microsoft Word a lot if I haven't made that obvious or talked about it enough, and so I show how to do this. So if you don't know how to check that accessibility using Microsoft Word, I do show how to do that in the video linked. I also show how to do this next bullet point in that same tutorial video. I created alternative text for images or a text explanation to support all images and graphics. Especially important if you are sending out the materials, but just do this as a rule of thumb for inclusive workplace practices in general. This is for screen readers. This is for anyone who uses any assistive technology. If the graphic isn't for decorative purposes alone, then you are going to want to do that. Okay, so I wanted to share a few tips for presentations that are more on the interactive side. Maybe you have some activities or some engagement planned, and it's not solely a presentation where it's going to be a lecture or solely your talking points. You want to incorporate your stakeholders, your colleagues a bit. So let's briefly talk about that. Regardless of ability status, I can anticipate all attendees will be able to fully participate in the activities I have designed. And so just think about, I don't know, something where you would want people to stand and sit or raise their hand. Think through if someone had a disability, if someone was experiencing something in their life, even if it was temporary, where they wouldn't be able to fully engage in that activity, how would you plan for that? How would you still make sure that person is included? And so my rule of thumb for workplace presentations, really presentations, even when I was a student, is to think through how, no matter who you were, you could engage that activity. It should be things that are very, not very strenuous, low level in terms of physical exertion, when you are having people to do any kind of activity. Because you can't make any assumptions, and you just don't always know. You may feel if this is for the colleagues that you work with on a day-to-day basis. But again, I'm all about just general rules of thumb, workplace inclusive practices, and so I just don't make assumptions, and I just always err on the side of caution when I'm putting things together, because you can't always anticipate what you're going to get wrong, right? But if I could foreshadow, and if we can think through what we could plan for so that we don't unintentionally exclude people, then we want to do that. And putting together activities where you can assume that regardless of ability status, people would be able to fully participate is going to be your best bet. Next up, for interactive presentations where you are putting together some type of experience, activity for those who are your audience. I used various learning strategies to ensure all attendees had an opportunity to participate and engage with the content, i.e. I built in processing time / transition between activities, individual self-reflection, and small group work. Not everyone is prepared, willing, able, comfortable with having a large group discussion just straight out. And so if you are like, okay, I want to hear from the audience and I have the time, the space, it's the setting for me to be able to really do some of that activity stuff, then think about the questions you're asking. Think about, maybe I shouldn't start with a large group discussion. Maybe I should have people work in pairs and go over the discussion questions, and then we do a large group share out. That's kind of my go-to. Maybe I can have like, okay, talk to your neighbor or talk to two people around you about XYZ, because you don't want people to just completely just like, get super nervous or just not be able to engage in like a super large group discussion. Also, if you're asking questions that are a little risky or, people might be shy about for whatever reason in this presentation, then starting with that large group, okay, can I hear from somebody, isn't always the best thing to do. Again, I mentioned building processing time. So you might put together an activity and that's great, but if you don't have enough time to actually process or debrief that activity, hear from people, take questions, take comments, then maybe you shouldn't do it because you don't have enough time to fully process out. And if you, depending on what that activity is, now I'm kind of getting into some of my best practices in terms of like diversity, equity, and inclusion topics. But in general, depending on what the topic is, you're going to need to process that with people. And so just have that built in and have a transition between activities, between your talking points and things like that. So you just give people a chance to take in what you want them to know, the information that you're presenting them with. Okay, now for some additional considerations. These are really going to point to some public speaking considerations for when you are, preparing to give your talk. I refrain from using technical jargon during my presentation. You might be thinking, well, if this is at work with my colleagues or stakeholders, connected to the work that I do, then they're going to understand the jargon. And that very well may be the case. But again, this is a series that is generally speaking about workplace presentations. And so if this is to an audience that is outside of your day-to-day colleagues, it's to the community, it's to potential clients, it's to potential students, whoever you're working with, whoever you're presenting to outside of your field, let's say, to maybe get more business, to communicate what the vision, mission, and values of your workplace is, technical jargon is a no-no. And then also just like SAT prep vocabulary words, right? Like it should be understandable to just about anyone. And so, I like to flex my vocabulary sometimes, but if I want to make sure that people are actually understanding what I'm talking about with minimal effort, then I'm going to want to, and we're going to want to keep that technical jargon to a minimum, if at all. However, in some cases, you're presenting some key terms, some concepts that the general public may not know. And in this case, ask yourself or have a check off sheet. I provide definitions of any concepts and terms that an audience would need to know to understand my presentation. So I'm a big key terms, core concepts kind of person. I like to really lay people down or ground people with just terminology. And so giving a definition list, maybe you don't want to spend a lot of time going over definitions, and so this is one of those handouts that you would have prepared, or maybe a frequently asked questions document, whatever it is, vocabulary, key terms list, whatever. This could be a part of the package of materials that you send out in advance, or maybe something you hand out in the moment to help people with understanding the concepts and definitions and things like that you're going to be going over. I plan to verbally describe graphics I developed during the presentation. So one of my biggest pet peeves is when someone, and a lot of people do it, when someone is presenting and they have something on the screen and they say, oh, you can read, I'm not going to read it to you. Well, yeah, you could assume that most people in the room can read, but again, there's just a lot of assumption there. Also, like, how long are you leaving it there? Is it even big enough for them to read? Is it digestible? So go ahead and just describe your graphics. If you've developed it, if it's cool, if you like it, if it's a central piece of what you want people to take away, then describe it. Take the time to describe it. Get this whole I'm not going to read it to you thing out of your vocabulary while you're presenting. If it's on the slide, then you should be, now granted, you shouldn't be like straight reading from your slide through the whole workplace presentation, but if it's on there and if it's a graphic, some type of table or chart or just like visual diagram, flow chart, explain what you're wanting people to take away from that. And if someone cannot see or is low vision or blind, then that's a whole, like, you need to explain it so that they know what everyone else is seeing and they don't miss out on that. And this last point, maybe not last, almost last, dovetails really nicely. I refrain from assuming everyone reads at the same speed or level. So this idea of I'm not gonna read it to you, you see what's up on the slide. You don't really know how people read. You don't know if someone has dyslexia. You don't know how quick of a reader they are. So if it's up there, then take the time to explain what's up there. Leave it on for a few seconds. Don't just rush through it, or ask yourself, does it even need to be up there if I'm just gonna zip through it anyways? And my phone, of course, just went off through this, so excuse that. And lastly, after the presentation, always ask for feedback. Depending on who you're presenting to within your workplace, you may have that rapport and those relationships to receive that feedback, verbally at a meeting, a debriefing. In other cases, you are going to want to have prepared some type of evaluation, some type of quick survey for people to fill out to give you feedback. Not only to because of what you're presenting on, but about the accessibility, about the inclusion of it. There may be some things that I didn't even cover, right? Or that we aren't even fully aware of as a community wanting to be inclusive and create inclusive workplaces that we're not even considering. And you'll know that by asking people, how it could have been more accessible to them, how your materials could have been more readable, more straightforward, how you could have laid out the room a little bit better and had some of those considerations. So always, always, always ask for feedback. Feedback is a gift and it helps us get better. That is the end of Module 3, and it's also the end of this little series I put together. I really hoped you learned something. If you knew some of this, I hope it served as a nice refresher. If it was helpful, please pass it along. I want everyone's workplace to be as inclusive as possible, and so I hope that you gain something from this. And if you are so kind and it was super helpful, please just leave a comment letting me know what was helpful. And if you have the means, a small token of appreciation, a donation would be great. This channel is not monetized. If by the time you watch it, I have enough subscribers to be monetized, then don't give me a donation. But in the meantime, that would be great. So yeah, tokens of appreciation are always welcome. I love you all, and I hope you have a great rest of day, night, morning, whenever you are watching this. Bye, everybody.